Hello and welcome to the Key Concepts video for Philosophy of Psychology Week 9. And this week we're discussing moral judgment. And we're going to spend a couple of weeks on moral judgment and moral motivation. This is specifically in the area of moral psychology. And there's been a lot of interesting work done in this area in recent years, trying to understand what moral judgments are, where they come from, how we're motivated to endorse them. So we're going to have a look at some of the ideas and some of the different thinking about what role emotion and reason play in our making of moral judgment, and how we sort of understand their interaction. So we came across dual process theory before when we looked at the theory of mind. And dual process theory is a theory that has a lot of, it's been used in a lot of different areas of psychology. And moral psychology is one of the areas where it seems to have been fruitful in developing a view of how we make moral judgments. So our sort of dual processes here are reason-based processes and emotion-based processes. And like the processes we looked at before, we've got one process when we looked at dual process theory. We've got one process which is kind of fast, automatic, and unconscious, and that's the emotion-based processes. And we've got one side which is kind of slow, conscious, deliberate, calculated. And that's the reason-based processes. So these two kind of processes are both thought to contribute to our moral judgment in different ways. So what are they and how do they interact? How are they related to different positions in ethics? As we'll see, there's an idea from Joshua Green that they can be mapped onto utilitarianism and deontology, two very sort of well-known ethical theories, and maybe they're sort of aligned with these two ideas. So we'll take a look at that in this presentation. So what are moral judgments, first of all? And Tyrrell comes up with this idea that moral judgments are responses to perceived harms. And the idea here is that there are sort of two kinds of violations. There's like a conventional rule violation, when you violate a conventional rule about something, leaving a window open or something, and moral rule violations, and their sort of difference from our sort of conventional rule violations. Moral rule violations are more serious, Tyrrell argues. Their wrongness is more authority independent, so they don't necessarily depend on an authority saying it's wrong. They have an independent kind of wrongness about them. They're more universal than wrongness of conventional violations, so they sort of have a wider site of application. They apply everywhere. They're universal, and they're justified in terms of harm. And that's a key claim, that these moral rule violations in particular are justified in terms of harm. So there must be some case of harm to somebody that we discern when we see or when we perceive a moral rule violation. Tyrrell's examples from page 107, he has in the moral violation where a number of nursery school children are playing outdoors. There are some swings in the yard. One of the children now decides that he wants to use a swing. Seeing that they are all occupied, he goes to one of the swings where he pushes the other child off, at the same time hitting him. The child who has been pushed is hurt and begins to cry. So for Tyrrell, that has the components of a moral rule violation. It's justified in terms of harm. It has an authority-dependent wrongness, and it's sort of more serious. In terms of a conventional rule violation, he gives us this example. Children are greeting a teacher who has just come into the nursery school. A number of people go up to her and say, "Good morning, Mrs. Jones." One of the children says, "Good morning, Mary." Okay, it's a violation of a rule. Children are supposed to address their teachers as Mrs. or Mr., Miss, whatever. but it's a relatively sort of trivial variation, and it wasn't intended to cause harm. It was, it was a mistake. The child didn't understand the rule, but there's no kind of moral sort of charge to what the child did. It's not as serious. It's not as sort of wrong as we consider moral violations. So the question is whether the harm account is universal. In other words, is it something that all people will endorse? And the notion of harm, in particular, depends on one's worldview, where other values might well define the notion of harm. So our account of what harm is going to be different depending on what culture, what society we live in. And in fact, Schrader argues that the harm account reflects a particular culture or view. And that view is the professional classes in US or Western countries, educated classes, who sort of endorse this view that morality is about harm. And they found that in India, a wide range of harmless violations, in other words, where there's no sort of plausible account that somebody is being harmed, were related to violations related to food, clothing, sex roles, etc., were considered moral violations even though they were harmless. An example would be something like eating fish 3 times a day, which may have some sort of sanctity thing in that context, but it doesn't seem to us to be a harm, and yet it's considered considered a sort of moral violation. So there's evidence that maybe the harm account isn't universal. Now this was brought to the fore by Jonathan Haidt's famous dog eating study. And there's a number of studies and a number of examples that he gives us here, which are really all sort of telling us the same thing, that they provoke an emotional response, but at the same time there's something harmless about them. We can't see a real case of harm. At least this is Haidt's point, right? That they're all very emotional. We get sort of something is triggered in us, but we can't sort of see an actual case of harm. So examples like this: a family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. Nobody saw them do this. Right, so nobody's harmed, the dog was dead. But I think, we can understand if you've had a sort of loving relationship with your pet, cooking the body and eating it is kind of a bit disgusting, right? So I'm not sure if that example really sort of does what Haidt thinks it does. I think we can imagine people would be quite sort of moralizingly disgusted by that. A man goes to the supermarket once a week, this is a second example, and buys a chicken. But before cooking the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it. Then he cooks it and eats it. So again, it's hard to identify a harm here, but our sort of sense of disgust, our sort of revulsion is definitely triggered. So a question here is this a moral response? Is there a kind of moral objection to what's happening here? And the flag example, similarly, a woman is cleaning out her closet. She finds her old American flag. She doesn't want it anymore, so she cuts it up into pieces and uses the rags to clean her bathroom. Again, where's the harm? And yet we feel there's a kind of something's being violated, right? There's some sort of sanctity perhaps that's being violated. It causes an emotional reaction, perhaps not in everybody, but certainly in a lot of people. So in Haidt's study, people were more moralizing the less westernized they were and the less high socioeconomic status. In other words, the less kind of, Western professional elites they were. They tended to sort of moralize these stories more and say that there is something morally wrong with them, even though there's no sort of discernible case of harm, it would seem. Also, many people moralize these stories, Haidt found, even when they answered negatively the questions about whether they involved harm. Right? So the intuitive response comes first. And then subsequently, people may be inclined to offer a kind of post hoc rationalization. And this is part of Haidt's view that it's really emotion that's doing the work in our sort of moral judgment. Rationality, our sort of reason, it may offer a reason after the fact. It may sort of come up with something that looks right. But that's just what he calls a post hoc rationalization. Post hoc meaning just after the fact. So once emotion has made the decision, reason might come in and try to rationalize it. But it's emotion that's sort of doing the work. So that's sort of Haidt's general view about how moral judgment works. From this idea, Haidt develops this idea of moral foundations. If we look at this chart here, we see there are 5 particular foundations. There's care, for which the alternative is harm. There's fairness, for which the opposite is cheating. There's loyalty and betrayal. There's authority and subversion, and there's sanctity and degradation. So the point here is that it's, for Haidt, harm is a factor, but it's only a small part of our moral foundations. And he finds actually that the sort of liberal professional classes tend to focus on the two things of harm and cheating. So what they care about is fairness and avoiding harm are their 2 big values. But a lot of other people who aren't sort of part of the professional classes tend to prioritize the other values here, things like loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And those are the things we see, in the sort of the woman cleaning her flag with the bathroom, right? That's a kind of loyalty, authority, possibly even sanctity, a violation that involves those kind of feelings. So it's sort of loyalty is kind of relationship to the group or the nation. Authority is respect for the hierarchy and respect for sort of the social order. Sanctity is about our sort of sense that some things are sacred or something shouldn't be used in certain ways. The American flag is sort of an example of that, right? So there, it sort of calls us to recognize as moral certain kinds of degradation. So according to Haidt, these moral foundations they're sort of cognitive modules. So they're cognitive frameworks or frameworks that we use in order to construct our kind of moral thinking, our moral matrices that we use to put everything in its kind of place. So they're these underlying modules that we use to sort of construct our moral vocabulary and our views of morality. The foundations theory suggests that there is more to morality than the harm account. As we can see here, the harm is just one of the 5 moral foundations. So Haidt's examples are effectively charged, as we saw, suggesting that emotion plays a key role in our moral judgment. And for Haidt, it's more important than reasoning in sort of driving our moral judgments. So we can think of 2 ways in which emotion might influence moral judgment. We can speak of a sort of causal relation, that's called causal moral sentimentalism, and we can speak of a sort of constitutive relation called constitutive moral sentimentalism. And the question is whether moral judgments are caused by effective inputs, right? Are they caused by our emotions, our feelings, or are they partly constituted by them? In other words, is what it means to be a particular moral judgment constituted by a certain emotion? Is that what it means to have a moral judgment, or are they just kind of caused by them? So the relation is different here, whether moral judgments are whether emotions are in fact the sort of constitutive parts of moral judgment, or whether they just sort of cause them. And of course, this is along with reasoning, and we have to see what kind of role reasoning plays as well. Okay, so we've got 3 different models of interaction. of how we might think of the interaction here between reason and emotion in moral thinking. As we said, emotion and reason might be thought of as typical kind of type 1 and type 2 processes in a dual process account. So in a lawyer-client model, the emotional type 1 processes are dominant, and the role of reasoning is simply to rationalize whatever the output of emotional driven processes is. So like a lawyer, reason just sort of rationalizes and sort of comes up with reasons why the emotions kind of instant decisions are correct. And this is, as we saw, this is what Haidt calls post hoc rationalization. Haidt does not actually say with Hume that reason is a slave of the passions, because he says lawyers sometimes refuse to go along with their clients. So maybe in extreme cases, reason can sort of refuse to rationalize what emotion is proposing. Critics will, of course, say that this minimizes the role of reason in moral judgment, and thinks of humans more as like non-human animals who are not responsive to reason. For people who think that reason is a sort of central capacity of what it means to be human, you're going to object to this sort of view if you hold that idea of reason, because it really minimizes the role that our reasoning plays in sort of driving our judgment and our sense of who we are. The two other models, the parallel competitive model, of course, suggests that they are running on parallel and sort of competing for attention, or competing to be the winner. On the default intervention model, it's sort of emotional processes, the quick automatic processes that are the default, and reason will intervene in cases where there seems to be a problem or a mismatch or a sort of, or there's something that doesn't quite seem to be right, and reason can sort of come on the scene and overrule, but it's usually emotion in the driving seat. So these are the three models of interaction. Okay, let's take a look at the trolley footbridge study, which Green did in 2001, Joshua Green. And it centers on these two examples of a trolley, which is on the right, and a footbridge, which is here on the left. And the end result is the same, but the sort of mechanism is different. And Green calls these, they're personal and impersonal moral dilemmas. Both of them have the same structure, and that structure is you're saving 4 people by sacrificing 1. As you can see on the right-hand side, that happens by a person pulling a lever, a person who may or may not be involved with the trolley car, where it's doing, or have any involvement with its maintenance or operation, but sees a chance to sort of flick the switch to divert the trolley onto the other track and save 4 people. On the other case, the footbridge model, here you see it's a person on a footbridge who is pushing another person off the bridge. That person will then stop the trolley and of course die as a result, but that person will stop the trolley before it kills those 4 people who are tied to the track. So it's the personal or the impersonal nature of the intervention of the agent that's important here. It's very personal in the footbridge study. You actually have to push the person onto the track, and so your involvement is a lot more personal. It's more impersonal in the trolley example. So the study found that people respond differently. Personal moral dilemmas rely on areas of the brain associated with social and affective processing. So in the footbridge case, those sort of areas of the brain are triggered to respond, and we get a sort of big response from those areas of the brain that sort of are sort of social affective processing, thinking about sort of this act and its sort of immediacy, and its emotional resonance. In contrast with impersonal dilemmas, we tend to rely on working memory and abstract reasoning, and less on the kind of social and affective processing. So impersonal dilemmas generally took longer to solve, suggesting that, again, that the slow, calculating reasoning process plays a role. And it suggests that they sometimes compete with affective processes, right? So in a case where our sort of personal, social, and affective processing is not triggered, reason can sort of play a dominant role. So it looks like there's sort of two things operating here. And that's sort of, this is Green's response to Haidt, that here we see reasoning and emotion sort of playing different roles in the reasoning process. Now, Green's mapping thesis, he says that the two processes, these emotional and the sort of cognitive rational processes, they're each aligned with a central theory in moral thinking, moral philosophy. The emotional affective processes are aligned with deontology, and the cognitive rational processes are aligned with utilitarianism. Now, deontology is focused on duty and obligation. It usually implies that the intention of an action is the most important aspect, why we do it. They believe in universal rules like don't lie, don't take other people's property, don't kill. And these sort of universal rules are sort of held as without exception. They're things that we don't question. They're always true. They are wrong in themselves regardless of the outcome. So that kind of focus on duty and obligation, the kind of immediate wrongness of something, aligns with the sort of emotional affective processes. According to utilitarianism, the morality of an action depends on its outcome or its consequences. So utilitarianism is what we call a consequential philosophy. The amount of happiness or well-being produced is what matters. So the thing here is utilitarianism encourages us to do a kind of rational calculation every time we act, right? What are the consequences of doing this? Who is going to be helped? Who is going to be harmed? Where does the sort of balance lie? How much harm? How much help? What if we do something else? How does that change the balance? So this kind of calculating about consequences sort of, leads to, this is how we think of our sort of rational process, our rational process working our reasoning process working in the moral sense, right? It's calculating and figuring out different options according to set values, how much happiness or well-being is produced, and sort of comparing different options according to how they meet the scale. So that's a typical example of what we might think of as rational calculation. And so utilitarian type thinking aligns with our kind of reasoning process in moral judgment. So here we can see the two ideas, deontology and utilitarianism, mapped onto the personal and impersonal moral dilemmas. So deontological claims are typically produced by affective processes, and utilitarianism maximizing claims by rational processes. So the option of not pushing the stranger off the bridge reflects the deontological idea that people's rights cannot be violated, even if the outcome might be better for others. So the reservations people have here have this kind of deontological focus that you can't violate some people's rights to make other people better off. When people endorse pulling the lever here to change the track of the train, it reflects the sacrificial response in line with the utilitarian view that what matters is maximizing overall happiness. So you're comparing two scenarios, comparing two outcomes and saying, how do they measure in this calculation? How much happiness, how much well-being? So that seems to be a kind of rational approach to morality. So the textbook uses this idea of up close and personal as a kind of as a kind of way of sort of distinguishing this idea. It's a reference to Green's claim that deontology is unreliable and not a good guide in many contexts. So the idea here is that people sort of Green basically dismisses the idea of ontology as a sort of unreliable thing. It's just based on our up close and personal reactions. So the psychological essence of deontology, he says, lies with the effective processes that are tracking something irrelevant to morality, namely how up close and personal our transgression is. And we see that in the footbridge case, right? That it's the up close and personal nature of it that matters. But he says sacrificing someone's life in an up close and personal way and sacrificing someone's life in a distant and impersonal manner do not seem to be morally different, right? They don't seem to be sort of morally different things. It's just the way our sort of affective processes get sort of bound up with this all up close and personal idea that Green is saying doesn't really matter morally. I'm not totally convinced by this argument. There seems to be an idea that one scenario triggers the agent's personal involvement in the sacrifice, whereas the other position in the agent would look more like a bystander, and the agent is more like a bystander and just changing the sort of flicking the switch to change the track. This would look very different if you're not pushing a stranger off the bridge but a friend. And this might bring out the dilemma in a different way, because utilitarianism often requires us to be impartial between ourselves and others. But sometimes this is impossible, and this may not be a bad moral thing, right? Partiality towards oneself, one's family, those are often seen as moral qualities. So I don't think we should go all the way to saying that being perfectly impartial, not considering our emotional reactions to how up close and personal something is or what something means to us can matter morally, and those things can matter morally in important ways. And it's not sufficient to say, well, you know, it's morally irrelevant because it's tracking this sort of irrelevant thing. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's tracking our sort of the moral stakes of partiality, and how sometimes being impartial might require us to sacrifice things that we couldn't sacrifice without harming our own personal health, our own sense of ourselves, and our own sense of who we are. So Green's argument is that deontology is basically confabulation. It's sort of making things up. It's post hoc rationalization. We have strong feelings that tell us some things absolutely cannot be done or must be done, right? And so according to Green, what we do is we make up a story. There must be rights that people have not to be used or sacrificed, and the rights or duties are therefore post hoc rationalizations of affective processes. They're not adding anything to them, they're just sort of rationalizing our sort of affective reactions when we say something cannot be done, something must be done. And so we use the terms like rights and absolute terms like that to sort of to sort of rationalize what we mean when we have these emotional responses. But according to Green, they're not. They're just rationalizations. And that's all we're doing with deontology is sort of confabulating, telling stories to sort of justify our emotional reactions, which he doesn't believe, as we saw, are ultimately justifiable. Now, I want us to think, as we come to the end of this lecture, about how we might think about reason and emotion, not as sort of in conflict here or not as sort of, you know, competing, but sort of working together almost. Is there a more kind of harmonious story we can tell? And it may be that we can start to sort of get that story by going back to the ancient Chinese philosopher Mencius and his theory of the four sprouts. So Mencius believed that human nature is essentially good, and we're born with these kind of 4 emotional sprouts of goodness, right? So they're the first shoots of morality, these 4 emotions that we feel. And they're what he identifies as the feeling of right and wrong, which is the original source of wisdom, the feeling of modesty and complacence, which is the original source of propriety, the feeling of shame and dislike, which is the original source of righteousness, the feeling of compassion, which is the original source of our sense of humanity, what Mencius calls Ren. So the idea here is that these feelings lead to lead to the virtues and lead to a developed and sophisticated moral view if they are developed, if they are cultivated. But they must be cultivated. And if they're not cultivated, if they're not developed, if they're put in a harsh environment, right, where compassion is not promoted, that sprout is going to wither, right? It's going to wither and weaken and perish over time. So there's an argument here that our sort of moral feelings have these, our moral intuitions have these 4 emotional roots. But the emotional roots themselves are not sufficient, right? We have to sort of cultivate them and grow them through what we do, through our thinking, through our sort of personal development, in order for them to develop into sort of full-blown moral virtues, right? It's the emotion by itself has to be sort of developed and cultivated. So this idea of our reasoning cultivating our emotion gives us one example of how we might think of a kind of harmony or a kind of a unity of emotion and reason in moral thinking rather than a kind of opposition. And we can see this as well if we think of interaction. Is there interaction between emotion and reasoning, and between reasoning and emotion in moral thinking? So how does emotion, or how might emotion affect reasoning? Well, we know about motivated reasoning. Think of a sports fan who is convinced that her team is going to win a particular game. A smoker who is convinced that cigarettes are not unhealthy. We're all guilty of motivated reasoning. We all sort of fall into that trap on occasions. It's a sort of common thing where we can see our emotions sort of driving our reactions, driving our reasoning. Now, sociopathy means that people's gut reactions to pros and cons of their possible choices are impaired. They sort of lack the emotional sort of basis to make good sort of moral and socially responsible decisions. So decision making suffers from impaired moral judgment. So that suggests that emotions do play a role, because we see people with sociopathy where their sort of the emotional input is sort of damaged. We see evidence of impaired moral thinking and impaired moral judgment. On the other side, we can see reasoning affects emotion. So in automated reasoning, perhaps reasoning is being deployed to respond to moral problems. Think of driving a car here, how our reasoning over time, when we're driving a car, you have to think about it when you're learning, but over time it becomes habitual and natural. So maybe a lot of our sort of reasoning is like that, right? It starts off and it has to be conscious and deliberate, and over time it becomes sort of habitual. And then a lot of our reactions might involve reasoning as well as emotion, because our reasoning can become automated and habitual as well. But of course, these automatic responses might not themselves be emotional. But there is evidence that moralization is development or changes in one's moral reasoning and beliefs, can affect one's emotions. So changes in when you moralize, when you develop or change your moral reasoning, it can have a sort of a knock-on influence on your emotions. For example, ex-smokers might regard smoking as not simply something to avoid, but as disgusting, right? They previously smoked and sort of enjoyed it, but they now regard it, their views have sort of come to the view that smoking is a, you know, their emotions have taken on this idea of disgust because they've changed their moral reasoning. And we know people on a health craze can think of all their previous eating habits, their lifestyle habits as harmful, disgusting, right? Because you've sort of, again, reasoning has changed the things you value, the things you view as important, or the things you view as causing harm or not causing harm. And so that can have an influence on your emotions. So our reasoning can affect our emotions. Another sort of society-wide example here, some people think changing attitudes about the LGBTQ population have been driven in sort of recent decades by emotion. And the idea here was that basically the changes were driven by more and more gay people coming out and living sort of normal lives. And that meant more straight people discovered they had a friend, a colleague who was gay. So more people knew somebody who was gay. Over time, they adjusted their principles to align with their feelings, right? So it's their feelings about their friends, their feelings about their colleagues that lead them to change their principles. So here they change their principles in line with their feelings. And perhaps that's what's driven the kind of change in explicit attitudes about homosexuality and LGBTQ issues in recent years, recent decades, is this idea of sort of emotion driving a sort of reasoning change. That's one theory anyway, but I think the general idea is convincing here that we shouldn't think of reasoning and emotion as entirely separate processes. They can affect and influence one another. They can interact with one another. Emotion over time can change our reasoning. Reasoning over time can change our emotion. Okay, so we're reading the chapter 4 of the textbook this week, which is on moral judgment. And as usual, we have the quiz 9, which is based on chapter 4. The markup assignment this week is an interview with Joshua Green, and there's a voice thread assignment as well. Let me know, reach out by email or come to office hours if you have any questions or you need anything this week. Good luck, and I'll see you online.